sponsor to be Spectrum Reach. My name is Rick Tullis, and I'm the current chair of the Greater Waco Chamber of Commerce, and happy to help host this webinar, as well as Matt Metters, our Chamber CEO and President, who you'll hear from in a little bit. And then most importantly, we have our guest today, Glenn Hegar, the Texas Comptroller. He's been our Comptroller since 2014, and he's excited to be here. He's said he's been giving his kids great economic lessons throughout this whole crisis, and he's decided he's going to do the same thing with us. He's got a bunch of he's going to pull out the whiteboard and start discussing with us, how oil prices can go negative. So get ready. You're going to get all your economic questions answered by Mr. Hegar. Glenn, thank you for being here today. Hey, I'll give you a few minutes to kind of give us your state of the situation.
Okay. Thanks, Rick. Thanks for everybody getting on today. It's good to be with you again, as always. Hope everybody's staying safe and doing as well as we can during this unprecedented time. If you kind of go back real quick, it seems like 1,000 years ago, but back in February, just simply a few months ago, Texas economy was still doing extremely well. We had over 50,000 job gains. We were looking at the revenue estimate. We always do summertime. We put out a new revenue estimate if needed, if revenues substantially change. In part, we're working on our cash flow analysis for our next fiscal year, which starts in September. And so we were talking about it at that time, maybe there would be a slightly upward revision just because the economy was tracking a little bit stronger than what we anticipated. And then unfortunately, March came. And so for so many of us, no one ever anticipated spending March or April of 2020, or who knows how much of May and subsequent months dealing with two different major significant issues. The first issue was a lack of agreement between Russia and Saudi Arabia on oil production. And unfortunately, the Saudis decided to increase their production, which could not come at an absolutely worst time in world history, in part because unfortunately the coronavirus had started spreading around the entire world, and having so many governments around the world going into essentially a lockdown for social distancing to try to enable the healthcare system if there was a sudden unfortunate mass number of people that needed healthcare because of the coronavirus, and that social distancing has caused an unprecedented decrease in activity in the economy. And so those two combined very early on, even before we went to social distancing in Texas, my team and I had talked about just the fact alone of knowing that oil was going to have a contraction. I decided that I needed to start talking about, at least in Texas and probably the US, we were going to have some type of mild recession because of the impact just in the oil and gas industry and how that would have ripple effects throughout the rest of the economy. Yet then quickly the following week, we went to more social distancing here. You saw kind of unprecedented impacts to local businesses, particularly those that are in the tourism industry. Obviously, we're already seeing the impacts to the airline industry. Just to make an example, on any given day, there's roughly about 2 to 2.5 million people that would go through TSA. They track the numbers of people through airports. On any given day last year, there's roughly between 2.2, 2.5 million people that goes to the airports. And at one point, there were only 90,000. I think we're up to a little over about 120,000. But again, unprecedented drops as y'all have seen, airplanes being parked and airlines having significant issues, not just here, but across the world. And then also we have the significant impacts of the hotel industry, as well as restaurants, bars, and that ripple effect that's having through the economy. So just last Friday, I had announced the revenues that came into the state treasury, and you'll hear me talk a lot about, and normally y'all do hear me talk more about sales tax and other types of revenues in the state treasury. And just a quick reminder, the reason for that is 1/3 of our state budget, that $126 billion budget that we have in Texas right now, is Texas government. 1/3 of that is federal dollars, 2/3 is state dollars. Of the state dollars, obviously the biggest portion is tax collections. And of tax collections, 58% is sales tax, and another 8% is sales tax off of automobiles and rentals. And so that's the reason I talk a lot about sales tax, because that's the health of the state treasury. So we started going back, looking at prior events, 9/11, the great financial crisis, what impacts had occurred then. Not that we expect this was going to mirror that in any shape, form, or fashion, but there would be some similarities, at least start trying to get an idea of what we thought was going to happen. And so therefore back then, there was a gap between the impacts to state revenues once the economy started slowing down at the Great Financial Crisis and the timing of decrease in sales tax revenue. There won't be a lag here. There was a 6-month lag then. However, as some of you may know, when I released the sales tax revenues and other revenues for last month, sales tax collections in April were down 9.3% compared to the April of the year before in 2019. Now, with that being said, I also noted that that was for what businesses collected from you and I, people who pay the sales tax, and they collect it and hold it in trust, then send it to the state government. And then I, in turn, send the portion back to 1,633 local jurisdictions for their portion of sales taxes. And so in other words, it was down, but it won't be down as significant as it will be next month because those were taxes that were collected in March and then they're remitted to the state government in April. And so therefore the point being is we didn't really go to full social distancing in Texas. It started around the 14th of March. However, it was in full effect in the following week. And so the point is just a glimpse of how the impact is occurring in Texas. As you may recall, there's unfortunately 1.5 million people have filed for unemployment in Texas. Unprecedented how fast this has occurred. And then also in the United States, it's 30.5 million. And so what I've been out telling people is that this is going to probably, in our view, not be a V-shaped recovery. It's not going to be just a quick recovery. It's going to be more of a U-shaped recovery. It's going to be prolonged. What we just don't know is how long the impacts are going to occur. Obviously, Texas is trying to open back up for business in phases, like many other governments in the U.S. and governments around the world. Just there's so many questions and uncertainties with the coronavirus. And so therefore, how quickly can businesses get back to doing business, and those that have been disrupted to such a level that they may not be able to open back up, it's still just a lot of unknowns. And so therefore, I just got off a call with some state senators just a little bit ago. Your state senator, Senator Birdwell, was on there. And the fact is I'd made the point to them that I'm going to give a revision to our revenue estimate for what will occur in this current biennium. In other words, that goes through August of next year. We're going to do that in July, and in part because we just don't have really good, solid economic numbers that have come in the Treasury for us to base a new revenue estimate off of. However, as I told them on that call, when we do provide that in July, because I'd like a couple of months of revenues, I have no doubt that we're going to have a downward revision in the revenue estimate in the terms of billions of dollars. But then again, with that being said, $126 billion budget, it doesn't take a significant adjustment, and it equals billions very quickly. We just don't know how many. On a positive note, Texas also has one of the largest economic stabilization funds or rainy day funds of state governments. We've unfortunately had these types of situations before of downturns in the economy. 2003, I was a new member in the Texas House. 2011, I was in the state Senate. I feel as though this one is probably going to be as bad as we had in 2011. The question is whether it's going to be worse. And so I want to get out and talk about this to manage expectations, but I'm trying not to be an alarmist. You know, in fact, that Texas has been through these before. The fact is we've got a lot of tools in the toolbox. I think it's going to be pretty rough, but the fact is we're going to see the other side of this. And I do think Texas and many other countries around the world are going to be much better prepared in how we ever deal with. Hopefully we never have another pandemic like this, but if we do, we'll be much better prepared, because unfortunately the time frame that this occurred so quickly, I just don't think any government around the world was really quite prepared for such an event like we had in 1918 with the Spanish flu. So with that, I'll stop. Happy to open it up to questions. I think y'all may have a set number of preset questions. Happy to go through those. And if you want to open it up to those that are listening, happy to do that as well, Rick and Matt.
Great. Yeah, thanks for those opening comments. And yeah, to your point, for those of you who are watching, you can submit down at the bottom of your screen. You should see Q&A button. You can submit questions on there. We'll be watching those, and we'll try to get those to the Comptroller. And I believe Matt, you're up first.
Yes.
So Matt's famous for giving really hard questions. I just want to I'm just kidding.
Rick, thank you. Glenn, welcome. We're so pleased you're with us today, you and Tom. So you had mentioned the impacts on the rainy day fund. We know there's, you need some time to understand what those impacts are going to look like. You mentioned other tools in your toolbox. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you might use the rainy day fund to backfill impacts on the state's budget, and what other tools that you may have also to backfill those impacts as we move forward.
Yeah, very good question. At the end of this current biennium, which again ends August of next year, not this year, next year, for the 2-year budgeting cycle the legislature passed in the last legislative session, we had originally estimated the state savings account, rainy day fund, economic stabilization fund would have about $9.3 billion. We think that has been downward adjusted to about $8.5 billion because of the impact to the oil and gas industry. And as y'all all know, a portion of the severance taxes that we collect in Texas goes over into our economic stabilization fund. So we think that number is going to be less. But the point being, $8.5 billion is a significant number that the legislature has next session if they decide by a 2/3 vote in the Texas House and a 2/3 vote in the state Senate to be able to appropriate some of those dollars out of there, which originally what it was designed for is to build up, just like a savings account, and during downturns in revenues because of economic circumstances, you use a portion of it to smooth out those rough spots. Also, another thing that we have that I've talked a little bit about a month ago, I instructed my agency that we were going to do a hiring freeze. I call it a strategic hiring freeze only because, you know, I'm not really going to hire anybody. However, if there's somebody out there with certain technical skills that we normally couldn't hire in the IT world, for example, with antiquated IT systems, well, then we are going to go hire that person, but it's going to be very, very selective. Pay freezes, reevaluate our IT projects. I've encouraged other agencies to do that. Leadership at some point will probably instruct agencies to reduce their spending for this biennium. That was one of the questions that I had from state senators just an hour ago when I was on the call with them and having that discussion with leadership, though I know several in leadership wanted to try to get through at least last month, try to get through the healthcare issues before we start turning to that budget side. However, there can be fairly significant dollars that if agencies, and one of my arguments is if you start early, you go shallow for long rather than waiting till longer to go deeper, you can really accomplish the same type of savings. And therefore, when businesses do get back to operate, say, for example, with us issuing tax permits and advice to those taxpayers, we want to make sure that we have the team and the staff there to be able to answer their questions and make sure that people can get back to business. And so typically when you cut state spending, you don't cut Medicaid, you don't cut children's health insurance program, you don't cut the foundation school program, which is essentially public education, and roughly that's 2/3 of the expenditures. And so 1/3 of the burden is really put on just 1/3 of state government. And so therefore the point being, you know, at some point you go deep enough, you start having to terminate people is what it boils down to because you're people. And so that's another tool. So those are two tools. One of the things we just talked about, and I've been talking quite a bit about, you know, the state of Texas has gotten a certain amount of money from the federal government in COVID package number 3. It was roughly $11.2 billion. 45% of that was to local governments. 55% is to the states. So that's $6 billion. That was mostly for specifically COVID type expenses. However, it's much broader than just personal protection equipment. And so we do have probably some other federal dollars that are going to be coming. So there's a whole lot of different mechanisms that we're going to have to, you know, be able to use to get through this downturn. And it's probably going to take all of those.
Thank you.
Hey, you kind of touched on something I was interested in a little bit. Another hat I wear in the community is as a school board member for one of our local school districts. So I know our superintendent would really like to know if his budgets and, you know, if the funding in 2020 is going to be affected at all, or is it really going to be in the next biennium when obviously the changes or whatever changes are going to have to be made will be made.
Yeah, I was speaking to Commissioner Morath just last week. We had a long discussion. Him and I stay in very close contact as the Texas Education Agency Commissioner. And in part, you know, TEA got $1.2 billion specifically allocated in COVID package number 3, separate in addition to the 11.2 that was coming for the state of Texas and local governments. And so we were having the discussion about what was the timing of sending some of that out to the school districts, because all school districts have had the equal challenge of trying to educate children virtually. However, all of them have had a little bit different success and setbacks, and obviously each of them have been different levels of preparedness to go to that. So therefore the expense side, and then also looking into the future. I would say that at least from my vantage point, as of this current biennium, I don't, as of today. Now, again, things are extremely fluid. We don't have rock solid data. So sorry to put disclaimer, but I feel like I have to. But I don't see that there is any type of proportionment during this current biennium, which essentially means reduction in expenditures to schools. I would hope that that is not going to happen next biennium either. I think, most legislators do not want to see that happen. Last legislative session, they had a very, what most would deem as a successful session in trying to put more money into public education and reduce property taxes. And I know that none of them want to undo any of that. I was there in 2011, and that was the first time that, if we're very honest, you heard some people say we increased public education expenditures in that session. Some say we decreased. In fact, we just didn't fund the enrollment growth, and which in essence mean as more kids come into the system, that's the first time we cut public education spending since World War II in this state, since World War II. And it was a very miserable experience. And there's some that have been around long enough that recall that. And I would say most are going to try to do everything they can to avoid something like that happening again.
Good. Well, that's good to hear. Matt, you got another question?
Yes, Glenn, we're starting to receive some questions from the folks who have joined us today. Here's a question. What kind of relief and further relief is the state providing and anticipating to provide for Texas businesses affected by current events, sales tax filings, personal property tax, and so forth?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, for those of you that are franchise tax filers, we postponed the timing of those being due. Instead of being May the 15th, postponed those until July. That way it matched up with what the IRS was doing. We felt like it was very prudent to postpone those. For those that are sales taxpayers, the question over a month ago was whether I have the authority to waive for 90 days the paying of those taxes. However, that's under a declaration of a disaster. And so therefore, use as an example, it's not going to happen in McLennan County and Waco, but when Hurricane Harvey hit the Gulf Coast, businesses couldn't go operate. They didn't have the ability to make those payments. So we could make a blanket rule over those impacted communities. But unfortunately, in this situation, it's all 254 counties. And so therefore, what I don't have the authority to do is go pick and choose which industry sectors to give that to. So therefore, the point being, it's a blanket for everybody across the entire state. And I didn't feel like that was the appropriate decision, nor did I think in doing that, that would mean that the collections for 1,633 local jurisdictions, I wouldn't be able to collect that, and I wouldn't be sending those dollars to them. So what we did was, on a case-by-case basis of businesses, we encouraged them to call us, to file their paperwork. We encouraged them to pay those taxes because they are held in trust from you and I, the tax collector. They collect them and hold them in trust for the state and local governments. However, those that could not, looking at their past payment history, we would enter into a short 90-day payout agreement. And so we've done that on a case-by-case basis with those businesses. Also was asked by many local appraisal districts and some businesses to whether they could use 2019 property values for 2020. Unfortunately, state statute doesn't give me the flexibility to give any types of changes in discretion in property taxes, and state law is really clear that January 1 is the appraisal date for 2019. And so therefore, you know, we're still looking as whether there are other options there. You know, some people may see their appraisal values be the same. Some may see them decrease. Some may see them increase, which has typically been the trend in Texas with increased growth. And so therefore, there's not really a great remedy or solution there from my office's standpoint. However, we're continuing to look at all different options that may be available. And so for most of them, as the state to implement some type of business, an opportunity to help businesses outside the federal government, one of the areas that I've talked a few times about is that, you know, businesses pay a small amount of money per employee into the insured plan. So in other words, when people are unemployed, there's a trust fund. That trust fund is probably going to be completely liquidated. It was over $1.6 billion. It's going to be completely utilized by somewhere between on the week of May 11th through the 15th. The state can go get a loan from the federal government, but what I've advocated, and we got clarification yesterday from the Treasury, U.S. Treasury, is that we can actually use part of the dollars that we got from the federal government in COVID package number 3, the $6.2 billion, if the state leadership wants to choose, to be able to move some of those dollars over into that trust fund. So therefore businesses don't have to continue to pay to replenish it. We can actually use some of those dollars to pay uninsured claims right now.
Thank you, Glenn.
Similar to the last set of questions I had about public ed, K through 12, we got some question about higher ed as well and how it's been hit, and what do you foresee happening there from a funding standpoint in the state of Texas?
There was a slight amount of money that was also brought in under the COVID package number 3 for higher ed. I'm not really familiar with exactly how those dollars are going to be utilized or sent. It is they're different institutions. They're trying to look at what they think is going to happen this fall. You know, most universities expect to be open. However, some of the larger major universities in Texas, if you want to talk about the bigger ones, whether, you know, I can't say for Baylor, but I've heard from a couple of the others, may expect students to stay closer to home than coming to universities. I know most of them are planning to probably have to deal with more virtual classes, even though they'll have a mix of classes on campus. Kids will be in the community. However, they may have more virtual classes. So I think you're going to have an impact to specifically student housing, you know, on campus dining. So I do think there's still going to be some challenges as we go through in the fall, but how universities handle that or how we deal with that in the next budget cycle, I think is still yet to be determined.
Okay, great.
Glenn, another question from our audience. Question is, typically business leads and builds the marketplace on its own speed and vision. Today, business is looking at how our local and state and federal governments spend and lead and project how things are looking. So if Texas is looking at a loss of potential hire freezes and even loss of human capital, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, how does this impact business confidence that they will be able to grow or lead and build going into the second half of 2020 and Q1 of 2021?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. You know, I'm hoping, at least from the state side of it, is that if we can, you know, reduce some of our state expenditures, but doing that in a manner that's prudent, like businesses would, that hopefully doesn't have a ripple effect through the state economy, is what you don't want to have happen. Because as you mentioned, you know, with consumer confidence, anytime an event like this happens, 70% of our GDP in the U.S. is consumption. And so therefore, any type of event like this, people end up having more savings. They don't spend as much, which does have a ripple effect through the state and the national economy, the world economy. I think a lot of the questions are just really, unfortunately, unknown right now. Whether you look at COVID, what the healthcare system does not know, whether somebody gets infected, how quick do they get infected again, or do they get infected again? Those questions aren't answered. Is it something like the measles? Is it like the common cold? If people, those that are infected, we know roughly 15 to 20% of the people show no symptoms. A third of the children show no symptoms. And so therefore, you know, until you get to that so-called herd immunity, where you don't have significant disruptions in the community, I think a lot of that, unfortunately, is just not answered, which unfortunately then in turn leads to, and you say, well, where's he going with this? And where he's going is trying to provide that confidence to businesses when they can actually open back up, and what the consumer is going to do. You know, I keep hearing people talk about, I want life to get back normal. Well, I don't know what quote unquote normal was, but I can tell you whatever it was, it's not going to be exactly normal again, unfortunately. And I think we're going to have to, you know, change and adapt to figure out from a business standpoint, how do we change and adapt to this new normal? But I completely understand, you know, businesses talking about, normally we're out there leading, and government letting us do our job, which is what we all like here in Texas. Is typically we have the philosophy of having a more hands-off approach and letting the business community lead and be the job creator, which it hadn't been so doing well here in the course of the last several years and the last several decades. And we do think Texas is going to get back to leading the national economy and growth. Unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit of time because of that double impact, the coronavirus, as well as the downturn in oil and gas prices, which is going to have, unfortunately, a bigger drag on our economy than it is around many of the other economies in the nation, unfortunately.
Well, and you kind of touch on something that I'm curious about. It's a unique crisis because it's worldwide, nationwide. It's not just localized like other disasters we've dealt with. And in that vein, even though Texas is the second largest state by population, I mean, I think the latest numbers were 10th on the list as far as active cases or confirmed cases of COVID-19. So, I mean, how's that play into your thinking? It looks like relative to the rest of the nation, we're going to come out in better shape from the COVID side of the crisis. But then, like you said, you got to weigh that against the oil crisis. And anyway, when you put all that together, what does that mean to you as far as how we stand with the other states in the nation?
Yeah, I think, Texas has led historically year after year. We've outpaced the national average, and we've been one of the fastest growing states in the nation in terms of population, net migration to the state, economic GDP. And so we think that will occur again. One of the strengths is we're a more youthful population than other states, affordability, lower taxes, lower regulation. All those things have afforded us an opportunity to grow at a quicker pace than other states. Unfortunately, with the double impact of COVID as well as that of oil and gas right now, with low prices and prices that look to be low for longer before they begin to rebound, and some impacts that's unfortunately going to have in the oil and gas industry and that ripple effect. Texas is probably not going to lead the nation in economic growth in the course of the short term here in the next year and a half. It's going to take a little bit of time, unfortunately. And just a reminder also, if you look at Texas, we're 19% of the entire exports that comes out of the United States. And so I remind people of that in part because Texas is extremely tied to the global economy. And as the global economy is oversupplied in oil right now, it's going to take a little while for demand to get back to where it was to deal with that oversupply, to straighten out and increase oil prices. And so therefore, my point being is I think it's going to be a little bit before we get back to that growth that we've had of outpacing the national average.
Glenn, another question starts off. Thank you for your leadership. Do you anticipate that community colleges will be affected this year by not receiving our total appropriation as we work to build the workforce for the Texas economy?
Yeah, great question. I think if you look at typically these downturns, typically on one side of it, that more people go to community college during a downturn than they normally do. So therefore, you'll see potential growth in enrollment numbers for some of the community colleges, which is a positive. But then on the flip side, from an expenditure side, I don't see a cut in higher education, whether it's community colleges in this current biennium. If so, any type of cut reductions will be done on a state agency level to try to maximize a certain amount of dollars that can be saved in the state treasury. Now, as we get to next legislative session, that's where I kind of just lay in those disclaimers of uncertainty. I just don't know how deep and how wide this downturn is going to be. I think we really need to get to this summer with the certification revenue estimate update that I'm going to give, and then try to get a few months into the fall to see what are we looking like for the fall. Are we going to have another event with COVID this fall? That parallels also at a time of the flu. Is that going to impact, the healthcare system, the way we're able to continue to do business? Are we able to stay open? I just think, right now, we just don't have a lot of those answers. And so I think it's kind of hard. My point being is, what is that drag on the state economy, which in turn will mean what type of tough decisions do members need to make next session? But I don't see anything to wrap up again during the current biennium, any type of decrease in community college funding from the state level, that is.
Thank you.
So another question we had, technical question on if something were to happen this biennium, would it take a special session? Would the governor have to do something that drastic in order to make changes in the current biennium? So
yeah, great question. I should have said that earlier. So for agencies to reduce their spending, say for example, in my agency, as an agency head, I just said we're going to do it. I'd rather get ahead of the curve. But for the governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker, they can recommend to agencies to reduce their spending. Say for example, during the great financial crisis, in between the 2009 and the 2011 session, if I recall correctly, the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker instructed agencies to reduce their spending by 5%. And then later that year, they instructed them to take another 2.5% reduction. And so we're also tracking other states on what they're doing. Most states haven't done anything significant, but the point is leadership among themselves can direct that during the interim before we get into the next legislative session. Just on, and so Texas, we've given leadership a lot of flexibility, essentially, to manage the state and the budget during downturns, and the legislature doesn't have to come back into session. And I've been asked the question, which is an offshoot, do you think that there's a need for a special session? No, I don't. One, they're not supposed to get together because they're social distancing. Number two, it's a 30-day session. I've rarely seen many legislators in 30 days agree to a whole lot. It takes a little bit of time for the wheels of discussions to get going. And then number three, from a cash flow perspective, we can cash flow in the state treasury and we can move some dollars around if leadership needs it for a response to COVID. And so therefore, there's just really not a need for a special session. And personally, I like it when they're not in session. My job's a lot easier.
Glenn, another crystal ball question for you.
Hold on, I was about to say, being a former legislator, that's a lot. You don't like to around, so.
Yeah. What was the crystal ball, Matt?
Here we go. It's in relationship to the.
I don't have a crystal ball, but let's go ahead with your crystal ball question anyway.
There's a lot of that happening right now, but we appreciate you giving us your best guesstimate on some of these things. We understand that there's a significant lag time and a lot of unknowns.
Yes.
We've been really fortunate in the state of Texas with Props 1 and Prop 7 and use oil and gas tax revenue to pay for our physical infrastructure. We have a lot of projects that are underway as a result of that. Looking at your crystal ball, what kind of impacts do you think we're going to see in terms of our ability to be able to fund transportation infrastructure as we move forward?
Am I back?
You're back. We got you.
Sorry. So I've had several conversations with several people in the transportation industry, legislators, several folks of TxDOT, and the long and short is we do know that there'll be a decrease in dollars that will move over because of severance tax collections. So as what we thought were going to be transferred this November, collections that I collect this fiscal year, which ends in August again, we make a transfer into the state savings account into transportation funding come November. So roughly we have 90 days after the close of the fiscal year. We had anticipated originally to send about $1.6 billion to the state savings account and $1.6 billion over to Fund 6 for transportation. We think that that number is going to be reduced somewhere, depends on whether it's $1 billion, 1.2 as of right now, but obviously a lot occurs in the next 4 months. So we still think there'll be a certain amount of money that will be transferred. If you recall the sales tax collections, once we get to 28 billion, then the next $2.5 billion moves over to transportation. We still think we're going to get to those numbers. As of right now, I think we were collecting on average about 2.9 billion in sales tax every single month. But however, now it is last month it was down to a little over 2.5, 2.6 billion. We think that number is going to go down a little bit more. And so long as we track at about 2.5 billion, then TxDOT will get their full 2.5 billion yet this year for transportation funding. Obviously, motor vehicle sales tax has gone down, what you and I pay at the pump. There's a question at the federal level on whether the federal government is going to have a transportation stimulus type some package at some point. That discussion is for later on, not package number 4 or 5, but a little bit further down. And so therefore, I do think Texas, we need to continue to watch and make sure we're in a position that if the federal government does that, then we can maximize the dollars that we would be able to bring down to keep all of our projects going that we want to keep going here in Texas. And so therefore, the point being, if there's a lull in transportation funding, I think that you see a full year before we have that. However, if the federal government wants to put an infusion of dollars for transportation, that may come at the appropriate time where you have almost a dollar for dollar swap. But, we're still trying to monitor to see what that will be.
Thank you.
Okay, Glenn, you may have touched on this question earlier, but just to make sure it gets answered directly, one of the questions came in from our participants is the state going to consider granting further relief for filing personal property tax renditions And basically says to present, the state has left that decision to each individual appraisal district.
Yeah, that's something that we're still trying to have discussions on what can be done. Right now, that has not been an action taken by the governor's office. And in fact, I think right now it is up to every single appraisal district. And I think part of it is, they're trying to get past so many of the other emergency issues that they're having to deal with. Obviously, it's a very important issue, but I think it's just one that they haven't got to the table on whether that's something that needs to be addressed or can be addressed.
Glenn, do you think it's possible that as we move forward, if we start to see impacts on our dollars that we have available for transportation infrastructure, that the legislature may look at alternative ways to fund our infrastructure, something along the lines of public-private partnerships, and turn to that more aggressively?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I do think that you're going to see from a severance tax perspective, those dollars that we knew were going over there are going to be impacted for not only this coming fiscal year, but the next one or two. And so that's an amount of dollars that's reduction. It's going to have, sales tax going to have to take a pretty good significant dip before those dollars would be cut off. But as you may recall, the legislature does have the authority, if they want to reduce that number in half, they can do that at some point in time. But I don't see them wanting to do that unless there would be some other type of mechanism to replace infrastructure funding. I do think probably next session, everything's kind of back on the table as an option, whether it's public-private partnerships or some other types of options. There was a little bit of pullback from those a few years ago as we moved more dollars, state dollars, over to fund transportation. But if some of those get reduced, that may be something that is back on the table as a discussion point, at least for some of your very large projects that, people want to continue to keep going, because if you stop them, they take a long time to start and conclude these projects. And so therefore, any type of delay, and I think that was one of the discussions, the debate that TxDOT had Commissioner's Court on just recently about I-35 through Austin, was something that should be put on the side, or should that one be continuing? And they decided to move forward with it, even though there were others that were saying, no, I think you should stop the pause. And so the point being is, those are big projects, and once you pause them, it takes a while to get them going again.
Well, I'm sure going into the next session, and I know we've got a little bit of time before that occurs, but your office will be able to give some leadership to the legislators as they're making some tough decisions. Have you had time to formulate some of your other ideas that you're going to put before them on how to navigate this situation?
Well, we keep a running list together of ideas and how you deal with these types of issues. There was just one just the other day that came about that, if the federal government enabled businesses that if they don't want to pay into the unemployment system for a while, I think if I recall correctly, then you can delay those payments. In other words, instead of making them immediately, you can delay them for a certain amount of time. You're going to have to pay them, but you can delay. And so the question was, is that something that the state does? Which would essentially equal about $288 million. Now, we are still going to owe that, but would it be better to owe it in the upcoming biennium than this biennium? And so that was one that I told my staff to go ahead and continue to assume that we would, not knowing if we're going to for sure. But the point being is, you say, well, that I don't know about to you two guys, but $288 million is a lot of money to me. Yes, the state budget's $126 billion, but my philosophy is every time you get 200 here, 200 there, you keep adding those up, eventually it starts having a B behind it. And so I think, it's going to take a lot of these different combinations if we are going to have to use them, and we just don't know. So, we keep a running list of different ideas and options, but, I think it's a little too early to figure out exactly which ones, only because we just don't know how deep and how wide this is going to be.
Glenn, a state economy is made up of multiple regional economies. Do you have any early out sense as to which regional economy, which of the economies throughout the state is being hit the hardest? And in the same vein, do you have a feel for how the Central Texas economy is holding up compared to others?
Yeah, great question. So obviously the first impacted from a cyclical standpoint of booms and busts is in the Permian Basin, with significant oil production and low prices, that's going to be hit. Houston, as the metropolitan area is much more diverse than it was in the 1980s. but Houston is much more of an old community than many other communities across the state of Texas. So they're going to have probably a disproportionate impact. If you look at from a tourism perspective, the San Antonio region has more tourism. Also the capital region has a fair amount of tourism. South by Southwest, was canceled. That was a ripple effect into the Austin community. And so therefore the point being is those that have more tourism is going to have an impact. And so those rural communities that are very tourism based have had an impact. Obviously those in very rural areas have not had the types of cases, and so therefore may not need to do the social distancing the level as other communities, but you've seen impacts into the agriculture industry. So many of y'all may have seen the supply chain issues that as we close the schools, people that produced, make an example, potatoes that goes to the processing plant. Yes, people are buying potatoes in the supermarket, but these were specifically in supply chains to go to the school system. And so therefore you're seeing entire crops underturned or destroyed because there's nowhere to go for them, and or there may not be the labor to be able to go through the seasonal harvests, like say, for example, fruits and vegetables. And so, those areas may not be as impacted much, but they're also impacted from an economic perspective. I think the biggest question for the central region, if you look back during the last economic downturns, the central region of the state of Texas was a little more balanced and didn't have as much of a downturn, didn't have industries that were impacted as much. But I think one of the questions for McLennan County and Waco in particular is going to be, as the question that was asked earlier, well, what do we think is going to happen with higher education in the fall? As in the two questions that were asked from a university perspective as well as a community college perspective. And so what is that going to do in the local community? And I think that's one of the biggest questions that's going to be, what are students back in town? Are they part of the economy? Are they not part, where are they going to be at? And so I think, the central region is going to be a little more stable than some of the others. But my point being is I think there's a couple of the unknowns with the coronavirus of what that's going to do for the fall and even the spring of next year for the economy there in McLennan County.
Thank you.
Great. Hey, I've got one last question for you,
Okay.
and then Matt will wrap up. But I'm just curious, as a someone who's spent their life in Texas and grew up in the farming community and done the things you've done in state government, what advice would you have for business owners right now and how they should navigate the crisis and prepare for in the future? Do you have any?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and no one's asked that from that perspective, before. And I think part of it depends on each different types of business. If you can be creative and think different a little bit than everybody else, that's going to separate you out at this time. If there's anything you can do to show that you're trying to help in the community, much like anybody on the chamber always does. That's the reason you're part of a chamber or part of any organization, to trying to lend a helping hand in the community. But also, I think we're going to have to look at things different than we have before. As I said earlier, this going back to norm is not going to be exactly the same. We're going to have to kind of change the way we market, change the way we do business. And it's hard because we're trying to read the tea leaves on what new society is going to be. As I mentioned to several members on the call earlier today, and I've cautioned the legislature, is we're going to see significant disruptions, potentially, unfortunately, in office space as well as retail. And then that'll have an impact in the state budget next cycle, because as you have lower values in communities in those potential industry sectors, because if tenants can't pay their rent or are not in business anymore, then therefore that's going to have an impact in the property tax system, which is also there as an ISD where you wear that hat. Well, the state picks up the share when the local share goes down. And so therefore, I do think there's going to be some of these disruptions that we can't, anticipate. But I do know that there's a lot of Texans that are really hardworking, very determined, very focused, very community-based, and we're going to get back to work and build back up this state and be better prepared than we were this last time.
Glenn, thank you so much for taking time to join us today. You've always been very accommodating and very gracious with your time for those of us in Waco, and it's great to see you again. We're all in this together. We're going to do everything we can to help on this end. We sure do appreciate you being with us today.
Good to be with y'all, and thank y'all. Hope everybody stays safe, thinking about you, and looking forward to the opportunity to be back in Waco again in person. Thank you.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to that as well. Glenn, thank you so much.
Glad to be with you.
Folks, I'd like to take a minute to express my warmest thanks to y'all for joining us once again for our Business Power Hour. Let me wrap things up by again thanking our presenting sponsor, First National Bank of Central Texas, and Spectrum Reach, who serves as our gold sponsor. Business Power Hour will continue next week on May the 19th at 11 o'clock in the morning. We're going to have a presentation that's going to focus on marketing techniques, and it will be presented by Nathan McCrary of Spectrum Reach. So we hope you put that on your schedule, and we hope that you plan to join us. And again, we sure appreciate everything you do for your chamber. It's an honor to serve you. If you need anything, please call us. Have a great day.